Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, thank you. Hello. One of the persons. Okay, so let's start the first day for the second day of the International Symposium. We had a really successful day yesterday, generated really lovely discussions, particularly in the afternoon. So we'll continue the momentum, and today we'll have a jam-packed program with some interesting presentation. But most significantly, in the morning, with great pleasure, we have invited Professor Sabina Knight to talk about the workforce and the issues in the regional area and at the regional community. And we have invited Professor Annika Fitzroy to facilitate this session called Chris Selby Smith's Oration, and she will give you a little bit background of why this person is significant. So just now I'll say a few words about Annika. Oh, she's shy. Yes. So Annika is a emeritus professor in health management at Griffiths Business School. She is a leading expert in household management, and with a working career spans more than 40 years, but she's still really young. In both health industry as a nurse and household manager and academic. Aim has been to limit and reduce the theory and practice gap with, sorry, my eyes aging us, with a focus on understanding and changing people's organizational behaviors to serve, promote, and protect the health of all Australians. I think she has true to her aim in the words and has been devoting herself to this work. And now I would like Annika to take over the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Excuse me. Well, Mina asked me to introduce to you the Chris Selby Smith oration. With several years ago, I had the pleasure and the honor of presenting it myself. I was thinking about this a little while ago, and couldn't actually remember what I was talking about at that time, but I'm sure it was pleasant at the time. So, who was Chris Selby Smith? Well, Chris Selby Smith was a very popular supporter of health education programs who died suddenly in 2007. He had been a major contributor to research on the economics of education and also public policy more generally. Chris became well known for his strong program of research on one of his enduring concerns, how to better connect research and decision-making in public policy, including in education, and again, trying to combine this theory and practice gap. His research was characterized by a focus on how economic analysis could contribute to improved outcomes in education, health, and social policy more generally. In his 40 years of research, Chris authored over 30 books, 20 monographs, 30 articles in veterinary journals, and 60 book chapters. In addition, he wrote many papers on behalf of the Commonwealth government. He left his life prematurely and established the Chris Selby Smith Oration in honors of this amazing man. So this year I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Sabina Knight, a remote area nurse leader and rural advocate. She is a founding member of the Council of Remote Area Nurses of Australia, a founding member and chair of the National Rural Health Alliance, the Central Australian Rural Practitioners Association, and an active fellow of the Australian College of Nursing, which we used to call the College of Knowledge. Sabina has recently established a new Centre for Rural and Remote Health in Emerald in rural central Queensland, and she's joining us from there. A 2009 finalist of the Northern Territory Australian of the Year and centenary medalist, she has also been recognised by the profession and the discipline of remote health with the Aurora Award in 2004 and 2020, as well as a member of Order of Australia in 2021. Congratulations on that, Sabina, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much for that very gracious welcome. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be part of this this gathering, and it's really nice to be connected across the world. I understand we've got people in Townsville and in Thailand, in Bangkok. So, sawadee krap. I'd really like to thank you for the invitation to talk with you today about this really important topic, the challenges of managing and developing the health workforce to meet the needs, the healthcare needs of rural, remote and Aboriginal communities. The health workforce is not separate to rural or remote communities, so to understand them, we need to understand the communities and what influences them. And we live in such extraordinary times. Today, we're meeting across the world, and I can join you from my desk here in central Queensland in a little town called Emerald. And it's located on the lands of the Western Kangaloo people in central Queensland. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Western Kangaloo people, and pay my respect to them, their elders past and present and emerging. It really doesn't feel that long ago, but true, I had blonde hair, not grey, when I was in Thailand, graduating from my Master of Tropical Health with one of the collaborating institutions at Khon Kaen University. The ceremony was at Khon Kaen. And I recall the experience of needing to call home back to Australia to speak with my family as my grandfather had passed away. And I needed to go into town to the telephone exchange and book a call to Australia. It was time limited. I had to wait for an English speaking operator and the lines that were available. And just think of how dramatically in such a short time, how our telecommunications have changed. So here I am talking to you from Emerald in this small, from my desk. I don't even need to drive to Townsville to join with you. So Emerald's a really small town, population 13,000, with a catchment of another 3,000 to 4,000, situated in a beef producing region. It's also an agricultural region with farms producing both food and fibre. We have citrus trees. We're very famous for the mandarins. Grapes, sorghum, sunflower and cotton are the predominant crops. We're on black soil, and when water's abundant in good years, these crops do well. We're also in a mining region, mining predominantly metallurgical coal, which is used in steel, and precious metals and gems are mined across the region. Tourism also features as an important player in this town's economy. And the town itself is also a health and education hub for the surrounding really small towns. The population's young, unlike some of the other rural towns of Australia. We've got bigger families, and so probably more like the populations in the Asia and Pacific regions. And I suspect the towns where you are, the characteristics of rural and remote areas across the world are quite similar. And some of the influences, when I think about how we would talk about this now compared to 5 years ago, we're really very, very conscious of this rapidly changing world that we live in. Both our societies, our rapidly changing industries, our mechanisation and the industrial changes which are enormous. Our farming practices here, we have very large farms, up several thousand acres or hectares, enormous machinery that needs one operator, satellite guided, soon maybe not even one operator in the tractor. And so the numbers of people who are able to work or engage in those industries are reducing. Our farming practices are radically changing, our food production is changing, and we're absolutely seeing the impact of climate change all too often. Wild weather events, we've just had massive rain down the eastern part of Australia and huge floods for the third time this year, wreaking havoc. and the impact of wild weather and weather events and drought, ironically, on water supply. And I know this is shared across the Asia and Pacific region. So technology, food preferences, diet, the great migration in and out of rural and regional, as well as across rural areas. We've seen many people move from the city to rural areas as both the housing affordability. Now with technology, people can work from home anywhere. And so that's driving some of the price of housing up. But it also means that people are coming to rural areas with expectations that health services will be city-like. And so this is really impacting on expectations of health services. We call them tree changes or sea changes, depending on whether you're inland or on the coast. I'm not sure what you would call them in Thailand. And so really when you stop to think about it, which much of us don't have the time to do, who'd want to be a health service administrator, researcher or manager in this environment today, where there is such a rapidly changing environment, and the impact of the change is like a whirlwind. It's an absolute eddy that means that health services are having to respond to these events. So whether it's cyclone, flood, fire, as well as keep everyday services going, along with reducing workforce and higher demands. One of the things I've observed is that these roles just don't have the time or the luxury to plan their program of work, do it, evaluate it, and then move on. It's really doing as you go. So building the plane as you're flying the plane, that is relentless. And the time gaps between big events are very narrow. And so these whirlwind times that we're living in really are shaping these demands on the health services and workforce, which means that the impatience of these external demands and drivers means that there's a real temptation to develop strategies that are short-term without also developing the longer-term strategies because of the competing demand for resources. It's hard to find the free air to plan and deliver and evaluate some of these strategies for the big challenges that we've got today. So many of the solutions are deeply entrenched problems in our rural health services and health workforce. If they weren't, we would have solved them by now. But they absolutely require strategies that will take some years to have an impact. I suppose the unifying experience for once around the world has been our experience with COVID, the impact of COVID. And whilst it's not been an equal or even experience around the world, what we have all experienced is the dramatic disruption that it has come with it. The upside is it's necessitated innovation. It's demanded services be much more agile. It's demanded responses from us, and for us to be much more outward looking, less looking at the service and more looking at the people and consumers and the population of our regions. And the people and communities are looking to us and trusting us. They're looking to us for reassurance, for our ability to provide care when they need it, and for advice, but also business. The business sector has also been looking for the same. And so from that really, really both perilous and trusted position, we had to be carefully honour that and make recommendations that are really sound, using the science and evidence as we know it, but also being very open about this is what we know now. Next week we might know something different, but we'll share it with you when we know. So dealing with uncertain times has been really important journey for us to be able to share with the populations we're responsible for. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in front of mind, and one of the lessons of these times for our implications for our workforce and our health services, is that dealing with uncertainty is central to what we do. So today's topic is really important. Nearly half the world's population lives in rural areas, an estimated 2 billion people, which is incredibly hard for me to imagine or picture when I'm sitting here in my tiny little town. As we have small populations, highly dispersed across Australia in rural areas. But I have been in Asia and in the Pacific areas, and in Asia you've got much larger populations. Although some of the villages are quite small, the gaps, the distances between are not great, and it's not far to a quite densely populated area, which has its challenges in and of itself. So with this population not having adequate access to essential health services, which adversely affects health outcomes, adversely affects the ability of a country or a region to develop, and it's maximise the population's opportunity to maximise their potential and their life experience. I think it's important that we think about this in a really systematic way, and I look for a framework to use in this discussion today, and I went back to the WHO guidelines on health workforce development, attraction, recruitment and retention in rural and remote areas as a framework to guide our discussion today. These were just recently updated, and I think they're really quite useful to use to think about. And they're arranged under the headings of education, regulation, incentives and support. There's many ways to slice this pie, but they're quite heavy. But the overarching principle that I've observed that we really have to live by, and is referred to in these documents as well, is that for services, educated researchers, selecting and evaluating a bundle of interventions, it's really important that there's a bundle, that we don't focus on single strategies. Focusing on single strategies means that there's a large investment that has really poor return and doesn't have a legacy. We've had some experience of this over the years in Australia. I recall, as if it was yesterday, having robust discussion and arguments about the importance of developing the medical and the nursing workforce strategies together back in the 90s, and lost the argument essentially in relation to Commonwealth funding and the support of some of our medical colleagues. And here we are now, 30 years later, and having to work really hard trying to catch up. We've got enormous problems with our nursing workforce, and we have ongoing problems with the medical workforce. If we'd done it together, we'd be in a very different set of circumstances now. So being integrated both with the workforce, but integrated with the strategies for the services and the workforce in a matrix manner is really important. And of course, the context is important. So various places in the Pacific will be different to each other, will be different to Asia. Various regions in Thailand will be different, and other countries that have joined us, as indeed the rural and the remote communities of Australia are quite different themselves. So there are principles that apply, but really important to contextualise. So the areas of the guidelines, they've been shaped under core questions and interventions, and the things that they say are really important, which will come as no surprise to you, is relevance. So in selecting the bundle, what's going to go into the bundle, it's important to think about relevance. So which interventions best respond to the national and the local priorities and the expectations of your workforce, your health workforce, and the communities. That's not an easy solution to find, but unless we consider each of those elements, then we're not going to be successful. Acceptability. Which interventions are politically and socially, culturally acceptable and have the most stakeholder support? And this is where it's not the loudest voices get a go is important. So understanding what's acceptable. For planners are often at a significant distance away from the rural communities, so it's important that they are connected and they hear all of the voices. And also, we've had some many good ideas in health reform in Australia, and they've been killed stone dead because stakeholder support wasn't there, and the ministers were unable to implement the strategies. So feasibility, what interventions face the less barriers to implementation? So if we want to get some success, where do we start? It doesn't mean we don't tackle the hard ones, but we start with the easier ones, while at the same time we lay the foundation for the more difficult. And this is where it's really important to be not an either or, but both. And affordability, which are cost effective. And what is the fiscal impact of this bundle of strategies? So if we've got as we all have, quite defined budgets, how do we use that wisely? How do we invest now for later? We all need wins, and so when addressing really, really difficult issues, and so starting with the coalition of the willing, I've found has always been a good place to start, and not wait for perfection. So rather than try to line everything up so that we absolutely guarantee for success, it won't happen, but a good coalition of the willing in an area that's got an appetite for innovation and risk, with people who are really keen to try out something for which we'll address these intractable issues, is a great place to start. And then effectiveness. We want to have synergies and complementarities, and an eye to potential unintended consequences between the various interventions that we're thinking about. Absolutely expect surprises and expect disappointment. So the surprises are the things that we love, because that's the real upside. Things that didn't expect that to happen, but that's a good thing. We've learned something new. And all of the really big steps that we've made that have had impact in Australia really have been a surprise to most. Maybe not all, but to most. But they've now become mainstream. But if we were trying to do it across the country at the same time, rather than an innovative project in one particular area, it would never have got off the ground. So that would have had the perfection burial, I'm afraid. And then, of course, we need to have an eye on impact. So what indicators will we use to measure the impact over time? It's really important we do measure and understand what we're doing as we go. But we need to be evidence-based. And so building in that evaluation and impact measures is quite important, but not having it so strict and confined so that we're constraining the actual intervention itself. So let's have a look at some of the recommendations that WHO have made in the guideline. The first one is enroll students with a rural background in health worker education programs. This sounds so simple and so sensible. And in fact, we know across the world this works. Selecting students from rural origin into programs that have got a rural focus, and then if they're able to study that program in a rural area, absolutely maximises your potential of those students on graduation being your health workforce in the rural areas. And in North Queensland, we are seeing that now. We can see the impact of the allied health workforce, of the nursing workforce and the medical workforce that have been selected on this basis. We're not graduating enough to meet the particular needs of the communities, but making sure that rural origin students are selected into programs are really important. This might mean that you need to consider a rural loading when you're selecting for competitive programs like medicine or physiotherapy or dentistry. that you compensate for where education levels might not be quite as high, as in education opportunities. So for those who've gone to private schools or high profile schools, for those who've gone to smaller rural schools, so long as they have the foundation and the knowledge required to do the program, that support can be provided in the program. So rural origin student selection is absolutely one of the keys to success. And that is something for which has taken a long time to embed in Australia, but is now something for which is understood to be important. The other thing that goes with this is locating the education facilities close to or in rural areas. And again, in Australia, we have seen the success of this. So in the north, we are, and particularly in Queensland, we've got rural and regional universities, but not only in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And so those universities are delivering many more graduates to rural areas because they're rural origin students studying in a rural or regional institution and stay connected, having their clinical placements in rural areas. Those city institutions that are selecting rural origin students and supporting them through their study in the city during their program of study, and may or may not offer them rural clinical placements, are contributing much less to the rural workforce. And there's a very active debate as to whether or not that's a strategy worth continuing. But of course, the high profile universities, so we're unlikely to see big changes there. But it's there's a quite an active discussion. So when you locate the institutions in rural areas, the rural integrity of the program matters. And the by rural integrity, I mean that the academics that are teaching in the program, they are also engaged in the health services. They're engaged in research in those communities. We call it accountability at the checkout at the supermarket, or for you at the market stalls. It's really important. Not only are they part of the academic capital of those towns because they live there, but they're part of the human capital and the intellectual capital, so that they're involved in community things. And so their kids go to school there, they might be involved in the clubs, they might be involved in the Parents and Friends Association or treasurer of Rotary, or those sorts of things. We're bringing additional skills, or have and developed additional skills that contribute back to the community. So not academics in isolation, but academics in, for and with the communities. And the dollars that are spent in those towns, they own their houses in the towns, they're spending their money with the businesses in the town, so they're part of the vibrant, making a contribution to the town's vibrancy. And the institution, the educational institution, buys locally, and so it also contributes to the financial vibrancy of the towns or cities in which it's based in these rural areas. And this is a really important component of these strategies, and something that we've worked really hard to develop. Staff absolutely must live and work in the communities, not fly in, fly out. Another part of this is bringing students in health worker education programs to rural and remote communities for their clinical experience. So if they're already in a regional university, then this is really consolidating their experience. If they're in a city university, this is introducing them to their rural experience, so giving them opportunity to consolidate their skills in a rural or remote context. And really, when we think about health professional education, you can learn your skills underground, you don't need daylight, but to learn how to apply them in a multidisciplinary team in a rural context and develop your communication skills and your understanding of the population, the health profile of those communities, the influences of those communities, things that will make you a better clinician, all need to be learnt in context. The other part of the curriculum here, by having rural placements, is that you learn to live as well as work in the rural community. So having a higher profile, not necessarily being anonymous in the community, learning to deal with confidentiality when you're known, all of those things are really important. And these can be learned and the skills developed and fostered during clinical placements. And that's a really important part of it. And so aligning health worker education to rural health needs here is really important. And so including the public health content that matters. Of course, having a multidisciplinary interprofessional focus matters. Having an understanding of the clinical conditions that they're going to encounter matters. So in the north here, things like rheumatic heart disease, tropical diseases, those sorts of things are absolutely front and center of curriculum. If you're in another area where other things are dominant, then you need to learn about those in your curriculum. And of course, generalism. Having a breadth of knowledge as well as the depth is really important. And particularly for postgraduate health worker education, generalism is really important. We need to be able to respond to the needs. We're never going to have very big teams of health professionals, and so having a breadth of practice not only has it more satisfying, but you have the confidence to be able to deal with the clinical conditions and population health challenges that present. And health services and educators need to be able to facilitate continuing education for rural and remote health workers. And so in order for students to have that really high quality clinical placement, then we need to invest in and support the clinicians who are going to supervise them or be their preceptors. So supervisor training and support, dealing with difficult students, teaching on the run, all of those sorts of things are really important, but also supporting the aspirations of those rural workers, nurses, doctors, allied health workers, dentists, to develop the skills in order for them to have continued job satisfaction and professional satisfaction to be able to continue to work in their areas and meet the emerging needs of their population. Again, bringing education close to them, making it affordable, making it accessible is really important. The strategies that have been much discussed have been quite contentious. Sorry, the issues that have been quite contentious in rural areas is around scope of practice and professional boundaries. And so an important thing here is enabling rural health workers to enhance their scope of practice to better meet the needs of communities. In my experience, is the smaller the rural or the more remote you go, the less contentious this is, because needs must, and you need to be able to meet the needs of the community. So having regulation and education that supports health professionals to work to the top of their scope here is quite important. And expanding the range of health worker occupations to meet rural needs. We're seeing in Australia a real emergence of the assistance role, so allied health assistants, nursing assistants, physician assistants, although physician assistants haven't really taken off in Australia, but you've had them for ages in Asia and in Malaysia, the primary healthcare, I can't remember what they're called, the HOs, well established in the health system. But having whatever it is, the health professional occupation we need, these will change over time. Technology is changing what and how we do things. We don't need some things and we need more of others. And we need to have the agility and the openness to welcome these. And this often provides professional opportunities for those who are living and working from rural areas, who are the workforce of the future, that are able to take on these new roles. And where compulsory service agreements exist, it's really important they respect the rights of the workers and accompanied with appropriate support and incentives. And so we don't have a lot of compulsory service agreements in Australia for those who are on rural bonded scholarships. If they're from metropolitan areas, or they've undertaken their programs with not a significant component in rural areas, they're less likely to return to practice, and so becomes not a good investment, and they have to repay the funds. But for those from rural areas who want to work in rural areas and are happy to take on bonded scholarships, then these are a way of providing incentives for those folk to make it easier for them to be able to access education, and they are returning on investment for sure. WHO recommends tying education subsidies for health workers to agreements for return of service in rural and remote areas, and I agree. I think that this is a good strategy for rural origin students, and I would just restrict the subsidies to rural origin students, because I think our experience with non-rural origin students has been so scattered that I don't think it's worth the investment, and the evidence is well and truly out. So where the evidence is strong, then let's tie it to that, and then provide a package of attractive incentives to influence their health worker, influence those health workers' decisions to relocate or remain in rural areas. There's been an enormous shift in the discussion in our approach to recruitment and retention in Australia over the last 25 years. It was all about recruitment and retention. So all a big focus on incentives, relocation, trying to convince people from Melbourne, Sydney or Adelaide to go bush, to go to rural areas. And really, for the last 10 years of my working life in the North, we've been really solidly focused on recruit from rural areas, educate in rural areas, support in rural areas, and build your workforce, grow our own. And so the growing our own strategy takes longer, takes a real commitment, but really returns on investment big time. Now, of course, health service managers have to keep the doors open today while we wait for this to happen tomorrow and into the future. And so there is, of course, recruitment from other areas, but looking really critically at what package of incentives seem to be impactful to be able to recruit people and have an expectation that they may not stay very long, and that they also will not understand the culture of the area of which they're going to, and there needs to be investment in supporting them to develop the understandings of where they are and where they're going. WHO talks about improving the living conditions in rural and remote areas and investing in rural infrastructure and services to ensure that there's decent living conditions for health workers and their families. And this is a critical component. There's so much evidence that out there around the importance of having safe and adequate housing for health professionals and their families. It's the deal breaker. And so this is not about luxury, this is about sufficient. And so making sure that the accommodation is available to all of the health professionals and is appropriate for the region. And when something breaks down, it gets fixed is really important. It's how you lose people, and it's also how you keep them. And it's directly linked to the next point in the guideline, which is ensure workplace safety in rural remote health facilities. And WHO recommends ensuring safe and secure working environments for health workers in rural and remote areas. So that's clinic design as well as housing design. It's also about managing fatigue so that people are not exposed to unsafe psychosocial safety, that they are not going to burn out, so that people get regular relief, that health professionals get regular breaks. And I know this is an issue right across the areas that you work in. It certainly is for us. And that balance of and competing demands for that poor health service manager that's got to keep the clinic doors open but ensure that people get regular rest and time away so that they are able to time away from the job, their holidays and for their important family events, so that they're able to keep going is really important. We also need to calibrate our expectations of the workforce. It's no longer reasonable to expect someone to work their entire life in one area or in one role, as might have been 20 years ago. People will change, they'll get different experiences. We're highly mobile, we move around, but people will return to similar areas of practice, if not the same. So it means that there's no loss to rural areas, it just might be a loss to those communities. But that occupational health and safety is so very important, and is one that our observations are in Australia is actually quite poorly managed, and we've got a very strong focus on trying to improve this. Other sectors have lifted this enormously. Mining's done quite well, health not so well. We want to have strategies that ensure decent work for health workers in rural and remote areas, and so that they know what sort of work that they're going to do, and foster the creation of health workforce support networks. In Australia, this has been done, and this has been absolutely driven by the health professionals themselves. There's very strong networks in the various disciplines. There's a Rural Doctors Association, there's Crana Plus, the Council of Remote Area Nurses of Australia, there's the Services for Australian Rural and Remote Allied Health, there's a Rural Dentist Network, there's Indigenous Allied Health Australia, Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses, the Indigenous Doctors Association, AIDA, there's the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, there's networks in all the mainstream organisations, so the Health Administrators, so it's just completely slipped my mind at the moment. They have a rural network, the pharmacy has a rural network. So it's important to foster those and to encourage people to participate and belong, so that they get connected to their tribe, but also we bring them together so they're not only in their disciplines. And so where they congregate together, such as we do in Australia at the National Rural Health Conference or through the National Rural Health Alliance, so that we come together and learn from each other. These organisations are supported by small grants from the federal government, so small investment, but largely the work of the organisations done voluntarily by the members. They're people who are passionate and true believers in rural health. They need a little financial assistance in central office function support, but generally are able to keep these organisations going. And it is a very good investment by health services or regions that contribute to such organisations. The return on investment's great. Developing and strengthening career pathways for rural health workers is important. So having that pipeline from undergraduates, seeing where they're going, having graduate positions available. This is has been a very contentious point in rural areas, where people think they need a lot of skill before they go rural. But in fact, if we send graduates to city, we never get them back in rural areas. So we need to create those graduate positions in rural areas, so we're growing them through the pipeline. But postgraduately, the training that they need to do if they're going to be rural generalists, we have a program in Australia for the allied health rural generalists. We have a program for the medical rural generalists, and we're working on something similar for nursing. Haven't cracked that yet. That's what I talk about. Just doing things in each professional silo group means that we don't have that momentum across the board, but it's coming. But it may well be that somebody might not, and by rural generalist, say in medicine, it means that someone who does general practice and an advanced skill. So it might be in pediatrics or emergency or obstetrics or anesthetics. They have a set of skills that is needed in the community and the facility they're associated with, as well as the primary care expertise. And that in allied health, it's the breadth of skills. So in nursing, it's similar to medicine, but based in primary care. And so having those career pathways so people can see them, having those programs that are accessible, that are affordable, that the supervision and support is available, is proactive, and the health services value their trainees is really important. And this is where research is really important. So we need to continue to understand what makes it successful. How can we develop place-based approaches to delivering these programs? Can we, in an area that has deeply entrenched workforce models, create a model of supervision so that we can get a group of trainees through that won't necessarily have sufficient supervision on their own? And then having strategies that facilitate knowledge exchange between health workers. So these are the conferences and forums and journals and things like that that we talk about, so that again, this is where small pools of money can make a big difference. Our Australian Journal of Rural Health was in fact started by the Association for Australian Rural Nurses. Now that group no longer exists, but it was formed in the early 90s with a small grant, a very small Commonwealth grant from Reset, the Rural Health Education Support and Training Program, that brought those nurses together, and they were largely based in academia, and they started the journal. And the legacy is that we now have a really highly respected Australian Journal of Rural Health, where clinicians and researchers and health service personnel and students can publish and share their experience and share their research and findings. And that knowledge exchange is really important. But also having regional conferences so people can get together to share. We would bring them together face to face, as well as come together virtually is very important. And of course, the more remote you are and the more isolated the workers, the more important this is. And the last thing here on the WHO guideline is raising the profile of rural health workers. And this was something that was really high on the list in the first National Rural Health Strategy back in 1991, 92. And I think is probably less important these days in Australia, because I think the profile of rural health workers is well established, and the value of rural health workers. It's not the consolation prize. You didn't get into a training position in the city, so now you can go to a rural area. Our approach is to our future students, our potential students, as well as our current students, is that we will provide you with the education and training to work anywhere in the world. You have to be that good to work in rural and remote Australia. So we have this very strong value that the skills and attributes of our rural health workforce is something to be admired and aspired to. And I think that that tone is well and truly established. There are some people, occasionally you hear the denigration, but it is not something we own or accept and dispute. But I think in some areas around the world, this is still a really important point. And it's true in some regions of Australia. So raising and maintaining the profile of rural health workers, it's important. So I'd like to talk just very, very briefly about two investment strategies that the Commonwealth Government of Australia has made that I think has made a really lasting impact on our ability to impact on these areas I've been talking about Australia. And firstly was the funding of the University Departments of Rural Health. So around 25 years ago, the first University Departments of Rural Health, the first 3 were funded, and then it was 5, and now it's 17. And I've just been successful in securing a grant to establish the latest, which is here in Central Queensland. And these University Departments of Rural Health are established in very, very remote regional centres or small rural areas deliberately, where there is high workforce need, high health need, and entrenched issues in being able to attract and retain health workforce. Specifically, where we were funded to establish an academic presence, to build capacity in rural areas, to support the local health workforce, to be able to take on students, to encourage specialists to work in rural areas so that they would have teaching and research, to be able to partner with clinicians and services to undertake research that was critical to them, which means the research is not often projects that attracts high profile dollars, if they attract any dollars at all from mainstream programs, but is important to the regions. And that we provide opportunities for the clinicians who live and work in rural areas to teach into programs. Our University Department of Rural Health budget allowed us to buy or construct student accommodation, so we're able to have safe and quality accommodation for students to undertake placements in the area. And then as we got more experience, we realized that we were limited as to how many students we could take. We had saturated our health services because they're small, as to how many nurses and nursing, medical and allied health students they could take. And if we continued what we were doing, we were never going to really change the outcomes, because the number of students we were placing and the student weeks that we were placing them for was constrained. And so we piloted what we call a service learning model, where as a University Department of Rural Health, we employed supervisors, particularly in allied health, and we instituted programs where we could run a program that previously was not available for the population, so we weren't competing with existing programs, and that we would supervise students to deliver these programs. So some of them are in schools, some of them are in the community with adults, so for example, in community rehab, post-stroke, neuro rehab, that area. In schools, early childhood, those children with not education ready or have learning disabilities with speech and OT, but also nursing, allied health, and other allied health disciplines. And so this service learning model has really grown, and the Commonwealth recognised its potential. And in an environment where all funds in health were being constrained or reduced, we actually got an increase of funding with an expectation that we could double our student placements and student weeks, which was no mean effort. So we're able to secure more accommodation and secure more supervision. And this really has had a dramatic impact. We are now seeing our students who've had extended placements with us be the ones being offered graduate positions and working in the areas. We've introduced disciplines we didn't previously have, like exercise physiology, into areas that are able to make a significant contribution to the workforce. And so these University Departments of Rural Health have really grown. So from that initial 3 to 5 in the first year to 17 now, distributed across Australia. Very modest investment for making quite a difference. And so some of us actually deliver health education from them. In Mount Isa, where I was previously, we delivered a nursing program. It was very small, very niche, but technologically enabled. So distributed education is not new to nursing, particularly in Australia, but making it accessible in a town like Mount Isa was. And so of the near 100 graduates since 2004, which is a small number, those folk would never have done nursing, not have undertaken a nursing program if we weren't there, for a range of reasons. They weren't able to leave town because of other responsibilities. They didn't have the confidence. Nearly 70% of those are still there. So that's a workforce that's not going anywhere. So having that sort of strategy where we change our view about what is a sustainable number of students in a program that can be customised and delivered in a small area is a really important component of building a workforce in, for and with a particular region. And we've been able to do that because we've had dedicated Commonwealth dollars that allow us to respond in that way. We also act as a pull factor. So we are out west, away from our regionally based university, which is on the coast. And so pulling the university towards us, engaging in the communities with us, and influencing curricular content and other things has been really important over time. We're also not bound by all of the activities of the university because we're involved in quite specific things, you know, key performance areas that are prescribed by the Commonwealth, very much informed by the last 20 years, but this has been important. So it's not just a university transplanted in further out west or further into small rural areas, but it is in a particular model that allows it to develop and grow and respond to local need. And that's been similarly responses in supporting the current workforce. We had great problems in recruiting allied health professionals, senior allied health professionals to supervise our students, because that's the very problem we're trying to fix. And so we were able to employ lesser experienced allied health professionals and support them and scaffold the supervision around them to supervise our students. And so we are growing that allied health workforce, and we're really, and our metrics of success are small, as we have, you know, one PhD finished 1 year and 2 years later another, or a master's, but importantly confidence. And so we've got clinicians engaged in higher ed for the purposes of building a workforce, not necessarily academic careers. So that is really, really important. And that UDRH, University Department of Rural Health funding and mission, has been really important to that. And in medicine, similarly with the rural clinical schools, they're not as old as the University Departments of Rural Health, but they're not much younger. There's only about 5 years difference, I think. And they have been able to develop medical training in smaller areas than was previously accepted. As most medical training happen to have a big hospital, a big institution, and most countries, I think, have had this experience. It all has to revolve around where there's many, many, many specialists. And in fact, we've been able to prove that you can integrate training and do it differently in smaller rural areas, not tiny, but in small rural areas. And those students perform as well at their end of year assessments, which are universal as their counterparts. And that the rural clinical schools, for those rural clinical schools that are associated with regional universities that are attracting rural students and supporting them on extended rural placements, are absolutely delivering on delivering a medical workforce. And those two strategies have been really, really important. Similarly with research. So building that research capacity, our typical higher degree student in rural areas is not somebody who's done their undergraduate qualification, then honours, and now doing a PhD. They are clinicians. They're nurses and doctors and allied health workers or Aboriginal health practitioners or health service managers who are trying to solve a problem. And so they're interested in doing that with some scientific rigor, and they're enrolling in programs for which we are supporting. And that one of the things that JCU has done is bring them all together under a cohort program, so that they come together as a group, they get to know each other each year, they come together for a week at the beginning of the year and a week at the end of the year to provide them with, you know, the education and upskilling that they need, and to help them maintain their momentum, because as busy clinicians, you know, and with families, usually there are, you know, many competing demands on their time, but the completion rates have dramatically improved since the cohort program has been instituted. And it's that having a group with common interest, and they can be quite varied in their approaches, many different disciplines, but what they've got in common is they're all from rural or remote areas, and they're very well supported. For others who are not doing higher degrees but just wanting to do projects, having that academic capacity nearby at the elbow in the University Departments of Rural Health has been a really important strategy, and being able to support people to do projects and undertake our research, as well as we ourselves have been in the same boat. We've had to grow our own research capacity because there weren't researchers in rural areas, but those who understand rural areas are best positioned to be able to know what are the questions that need to be asked and how do we approach answering them. And so being able to partner then across Australia with like-minded people has been really, really very important. So these are some of the things that I have found that have really, and I've observed, and are well evidenced in the literature. So I haven't hit you with a PowerPoint today. I just wanted to have the conversation around using the WHO guidelines as a framework and to talk about our experience. We are now 4 months into establishing a brand new University Department of Rural Health in Emerald for Central Queensland. And it's been a delightful, if not tedious, project to commence. I've forgotten what it takes to start up from the beginning, but we are so welcomed into the community, and the town is so excited by what we're bringing, the potential of what we're bringing in terms of access to health education programs, access to university with bridging courses, support for students. We've bought 2 houses for accommodation. We're raising the profile of the town in being a destination of high regard, the jewel in the crown of destination to do a clinical placement, and population's really, really excited about this. And we've had a very warm welcome. I think, because now with social media, we are more of a known quantity, and people are, and the community leaders have very much embraced the strategy, but we have to live up to expectations. So I hope to be able to report in 2 years' time that we have absolutely delivered on that. And we have to have patience ourselves, because you don't get anywhere in a hurry. And so one of the things that we need to do for the Commonwealth is submit a research plan. And I said we would submit a research plan after we run a research priorities workshop with the community, when the clinicians and the services and community people are able to tell us what are the research priorities, and then we'll respond. So it won't be what we think, it'll be what they think. And that will be our response. And so I'm a firm believer that you can absolutely develop, support research capacity in rural areas. You just need to have a different time frame, and we need to have the support structures in place. We need to recognise that it's not easy to get access to the mainstream research grants, and at the same time we're advocating strongly federally with the main research programs and the minister to change some of the guidelines to ensure that small rural areas do get access to the important grants, because there's important work to be done, but not disproportionately. But please don't tell us that you're allocating rural research dollars if they're not going to rural researchers. And so that rural integrity is something we're keeping them honest. So I would like to thank the SHAPE Management Committee for this invitation to talk with you today, and I really look forward to questions. Ka kun ka. Ka kun ka.
Unmute. Thanks, Leah. That was incredibly insightful. I certainly learned a lot, and some of the things that came out for me was, especially what you said in the end, was this co-creation with people within the community to actually advance the community. And I think people from the city like myself can definitely learn from that. I'm sure that there's lots of questions. Does anybody like to ask a question to speak?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. It's very interesting. Sabina, I'm actually representing the University of Papua New Guinea, talking on similar lines later on. But the rural medical training that you spoke about, is that the same training that a doctor would have in a city university? Or is it different training?
Yes, it's the same, as in it's got to meet the Australian Medical Council accreditation guidelines, but the training's delivered in a regional area. So for James Cook University, the medical program's delivered out of Townsville, Cairns and Mackay and Mount Isa. So the preclinical years, the first 3 years are done in Townsville. And then the last 3 years are done in Cairns and Mackay, as well as Townsville, and a great majority of that can also be done in Mount Isa, but substantial parts of those times could be done in very small areas. The model that really influenced medical training in Australia is more than 20 years ago. Flinders University ran a project called the Riverland Project, the Parallel Curriculum Project, where they took students and integrated them with GPs in 5 tiny rural towns, just 2 hours from Adelaide. And so they spent the year, their final year, with these GPs who were rural generalists. They looked after general practice and the hospital. And so rather than those students do their med surge, pediatrics, obstetrics, mental health and general practice rotations, they did all of those integrated across the year, and they were taught by the GPs. All of those students passed, and all of them, the greater majority of them, did better than their colleagues back in the big city. And that was the groundbreaking project in Australia that says you can do medical training outside of the city. And from that, rural clinical schools were funded. And I think we can move this further. And with the distributed network, the support of high quality technology that works pretty well with low bandwidth, like Zoom, we can deliver tutes and lectures in different ways and create clinical opportunities. And so, you know, I could imagine in PNG where you've got, you know, up in Mount Hagen or, you know, places like that, where you could have a network of places where you've got small numbers of students who are integral to the workforce and the activity of that health facility, that are getting high quality clinical experience. So they're building on their pre-clinical years for their clinical years. That JCU is an undergraduate program, so it's a 6-year program. Some of the other programs are graduate programs. But I think it's important to build in that additional clinical experience. So that's that consolidating your learning. So when you graduate and as an intern, you are really, really useful and confident in your clinical setting.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you, Sabrina. I found that really inspiring and very heartening, actually, because there's always so much focus on the problems, and the problems and the barriers are real. Let's not pretend they're not. But it was very inspiring to hear about, you know, what's possible when you step outside of the problem framework and just kind of work out some things and try some things. I come from Victoria. I'm metro based, and I've got an academic background, but I've been working as a consultant in health and community services for quite some time now. And I say with services, not at them. And I've learned in doing some quite big projects in rural and remote areas, and in one case in family violence, helping them develop strategies and deal with workforce issues in the family violence area, which of course resonates through everything, including health, often sits underneath things. And one of the things that in the quite extensive consultations we did with service providers and members of the community was unpack or help them unpack this notion of rurality, which we found to be a very useful concept that they raised once it was unpacked, because it gave people a sense of not just, it was way beyond the barriers and the problems. It was actually about a kind of a deeper understanding in my sense.
Cultural and identity.
Yes, exactly, identity stuff. And it helped people be much more affirming, if you like, around the benefits of rurality and what that, and I think that's a lot of that sits behind what you're talking about, of, you know, things being of and coming from rural areas. So I kind of was interested in hearing a bit more about that, particularly in relation to metro people, which is that when services are designed, and particularly statewide services, for a lot of people in the department, you know, rural and regional begins and ends at Ballarat and Geelong. You know, I have no freaking idea, quite frankly. And it's like the mindset is so fixed. So I'd be interested in hearing, sorry, it's a very long question, I know, but I'll be interested in hearing from you about how you will influence that mindset, if you like, and get that kind of notion of rurality a bit better understood. Sorry, it's a long question.
It's fine. So I think people from rural areas understand it well, but what
Yes.
one of the tracks is talking about rurality in terms of disadvantage or in language that's negative, and it's really important it's a strength-based approach. That what's good about rural, what does rural, you know, rural areas feeds our countries everywhere, you know, whether it's the fishermen or the rice farmers or the beef producers. Rural people produce our food and fibre. Rural areas have attributes to it for which are highly desired. Some of the life expectancy differences in between rural and metropolitan areas are often to do with severely entrenched disadvantage, and then on one hand, so Aboriginal populations for which have been much marginalised against, and we need to, and we know that we need to close the gap, and we're working towards this. The other thing in rural areas is that we have higher rates of illness and death associated with occupation and distance. So some of the industries are riskier, so the people are harder to access in relation to health promotion, and population is less impacted by some of the big public health measures. So we look at how successful we've been in Australia with reducing smoking. So the banning smoking in workplaces, huge impact and relatively quickly. But if you're one of 3 or 5 or 10 in a rural enterprise, nobody sees and it doesn't happen. So it takes years before you get an impact in that area. So that in that small area, and of course then our road accident rate is, whilst it isn't as bad as some international areas, it's a bigger issue in rural areas. And again, it's some of the public health measures. The impact of single car accidents, people who are not wearing seatbelts, is just phenomenal. And if you, particularly in the far north and the vast stations of Australia where you can literally drive for a day before you leave the boundaries of the farm, people not necessarily wearing seatbelts, and then they leave there and drive to town without thinking to put the seatbelt on, young people particularly, and if they have an accident, it's more likely to be a fatal accident and they're survivable accidents. So we've got to find ways to engage with them and engage with them about drink driving, so those sorts of things. But understanding, so I'm saying it's a long answer to your question, but understanding, unpacking what is it that makes up the health differential, and then working with people to understand and promote an understanding of what's of rural life and city life, and being proud of both, not trying to have one over the others, really important. And one of the things the University Department of Rural Health Funding really did in its wisdom early days was that we had a set of KPIs we had to achieve, but we were free to innovate as much as we wanted to achieve them. So we did, it wasn't a strict program, and I think this is where often mainstream programs get it wrong. Rather than say these are the outcomes you need to achieve, and so a program that's conceived in Melbourne for, Beechworth or somewhere, a small rural area, Nil in Victoria, is best. The community or the health services themselves are best situated to work out how to achieve those outcomes, to use those dollars really wisely and get the most out of them and get the best outcomes they can, rather than have to institute something for which has been mainstream conceived. And I think they're really, really important things. And that's true in education. So same deal. If you're delivering health worker education in a small area, the way you put it together and what you, again, you still got to reach the accreditation standards and deliver the content, the curriculum as accredited, but you should be free enough to be able to contextualize that locally, so you're meeting the local needs, you're delivering it in a way that means that people have got the best access possible to be able to do it. And for those who are educationally disadvantaged, they need a lot of support in the first couple of years to get them in the same paddock, let alone in the same field. So there's no such thing as a level playing field. It might be, they should be in the level playing field when they graduate, because they've still got to achieve the same pass levels as everybody else. It's what do we do to help them to do it is important. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Can you take yourself off?
She's coming. She's
Okay.
coming.
I can hear you now.
Okay. You want to ask your question, Judith?
Thank you for your presentation. It's always inspiring to hear from someone who's worked in the same area for a very long time. But I just wondered, as someone who's worked in the same area for a very long time, and I appreciate all that your team and the government is doing to improve rural health. But I just wanted to hear from your view, after working in rural area for such a long time, are we making progress towards closing the gap in terms of distribution of health outcomes between urban and rural areas? Thank you.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Our challenge is that we're making great gains across the board, and trying to keep pace with those gains and close the gap has been our challenge. But without a doubt, we're seeing improvements in some really core indicators. And again, we have to be careful to not get discouraged when we don't meet targets for which we're never going to be met in 1 or 2 years. But we know are going to take a longer strategy, but we have to maintain commitment to those strategies to get it close. So if we look at the sort of the social determinants of health and chronic disease, many of the determinants of chronic disease are set up in childhood. And so for those children who missed out when we didn't have sufficient investment in them, we know what their trajectory is. So we've got to provide the best possible care for them throughout their life so that they have the best possible life they can. We're not going to change the number of people with chronic disease, but we should change their experience of living with chronic disease. At the same time, we've got to invest well upstream so that we are preventing those predeterminants that will set up the chain reaction for chronic disease very early. And we won't see the impact of that for some years. So this is a really big thing for government, because on one hand, it looks like a failure because you've still got all these numbers. And on the other hand, it's hard to measure success when you haven't got something. So, but we know we've got to stay the course. We absolutely know we've got to stay the course. So my sense is that we are making a significant difference, but not enough. And certainly in Australia, in remote Australia particularly, the issue of housing and is enormous, and the impact of poor housing, as we know, is enormous. And until we tackle housing as well as education, early childhood education, we are not going to have the outcomes that we want. And that is the big challenge in Australia, is tackling those big infrastructure projects in a way that is going to deliver outcomes for people, where we've got enormous overcrowding and insufficient housing everywhere. And if we are not able to build enough new whilst preparing what's there, so that we are meeting, and we've got, you know, very fertile young populations that are producing lots of wonderful young children, our future, our nation's future, we have absolutely got to be able to address with that. And that's our vulnerable point in Australia, and it will continue to have an impact. So we're going to get better at managing chronic disease. We're not as good at preventing it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned that sometimes the targets can look a bit different, but the experiences of people on the ground can also be different. Yeah. And just to extend my question, what are people saying about how they experience the care? Has that changed in how people express their experience, or how people express how they're experiencing the care in the rural area?
People in rural areas are very frustrated around their access to care, particularly primary care, general practice services, because they want, in their memory, they want a doctor who's their doctor, who they see every time, and they want them to be available when they need them, and that's clearly not possible. So they're less tolerant with turnover of staff. They, but at the same time, have increased expectations of what services should be and should be able to be provided to them, and so are more vocal in demanding access to primary care, and that's not a bad thing. I find in rural areas people are very, very tolerant and often drive the agenda around things like telehealth, because the last thing they want to do is drive 8 hours to see a specialist to be told everything's good, come back in 3 months, or, you know, come back next week because something wasn't organised. And for people who don't have the resources to do that, that really impacts on their ability to access care. So sensibly, people have been advocating for a long time for telehealth, not as a replacement, but as a complement strategy to access services. In the more remote areas, where the services are often nurse-led and Aboriginal health practitioner-led, people are very, very tolerant of and very protective of their primary care services, but they're very intolerant of high turnover. And if services are not careful and they don't support their staff so that they've got high turnover rates in their primary care staff, then the community get pretty cranky. And we've seen a lot of that in Australia in more recent times, where there is the investment in supporting staff to be able to stay longer term, so having regular breaks, fatigue leave, all of those things, access to education, it has not been good, and we've got to improve that.
And my last question, what has made you to stay, and what motivates you every day to look forward to go to work?
I love what I do. You know, rural health, remote health's my gig. So I'm a remote area nurse, and so and I miss my clinical practice, because I used to keep a hand in. I'm still trying to keep a hand in, but I'm not like I used to. Yeah, it is such a privilege to be able to work with people, and it's about you're one of the mob. You're one of the people living there as well as working there. I'm a country girl. I love the bush, and practice is so satisfying. It is so interesting and so diverse. You can't get bored. And in these years where we've been trying to solve these deeply entrenched problems, it has been the coming together of those who are interested to saying, you know, someone should do something, you know, someone should do something about whatever it is, whether it's clinical guidelines, how do we treat this? And then looking around, and there's no, okay, well, let's have a go, you know, we'll do it. What do we need to do? And this coming together of people to say, well, how do we solve the problems to make us better clinicians, or make us better at what we do, or to get better infrastructure so the clinic's safer for people who come in, or whatever. And it's been the outcome of all of that that has just kept me going, because it has been dramatic, the impact it's had. And we can be really proud of that. And it's no one person has made it happen. It's all the people who come together to do it. And the thing I love about remote, the more remote you are and the smaller rural you are, is you've just got absolute freedom to innovate. You have to. It's the mother of invention. And important to have this environment and the appetite for risk, to innovate, which means you can do things differently and try out different things, and apologise later. Oh, really? I couldn't do that. Oh, look, it worked.
Okay, Sabina, on that note, that is terrific. Thank you very much. Please, everybody, join me in thanking Sabina for her insightful presentation today. And thanks, everybody, for the
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Hopefully we'll see you on campus very soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I think it has been quite a long time for the people in the room sitting here and focusing on listening to Sabina and the discussion. So I have a slight adjustment of the time because one of the presenters in the afternoon won't be presenting. So we quickly have a break, including those online. Let's quickly have a break. Bring a cup of coffee back, and we start in 5 minutes. Okay, maximum 5 minutes. Go and grab a cup of coffee.